We're here with the first of Nvidia's GeForce RTX 50 series laptops to hit PC labs. What we have in front of us here is the Razer Blade 16. Matt has been working with this machine over the past week. Nvidia RTX 50 series based laptops are hitting the streets at the end of March at a variety of price points in 3 different GPU configurations and a whole lot of different models. So Matt, what can you tell us about this particular Razer model that we have here?
Yeah, so this is the Razer Blade 16, always a premium laptop. These are expensive sort of no matter how you slice it, even more so because the first GPU that Nvidia sent out for testing among its mobile RTX 50 series chips is the 5090. As we know from the desktop side, that is the top GPU in the stack.
Right, so what other GPUs are hitting at the same time?
Yeah, we're also going to see the 5070 Ti and the 5080 launching in the same time window.
Right, I understand there's a 5070 coming eventually, but that's not launching in laptops at the same time that the top 3 in the stack are.
Yes, and in this laptop in particular, as I said, premium, they're all expensive. Even the 5070 Ti configuration of this laptop is $3,000 starting price. Once you get up to the 5090, it's $4,500. So we know that's enthusiast pricing. This is kind of a best case scenario sort of RTX 5090 test case. That's what Nvidia sent out first, and that's what we've run our first benchmarks on.
So Matt, what's actually in this configuration of the Blade 16 laptop?
Yeah, so in addition to the 5090, obviously, this is a 16-inch screen, 1600p resolution. It's 2560 by 1600, 32 gigabytes of memory, 2 terabytes of storage. You're actually forced to bump up when you take the 5090. You get 2 terabytes of storage. You get the highest end Ryzen AI 9 processor. You get a lower end Ryzen 9 processor with the other GPUs.
I see. So the Ryzen 9 that's in this is a Strix Point chip? Is that what this is?
Yes, the HX370.
Okay.
So high-end chip. You'll see in the comparisons when we get to the performance testing, we compare it against some Intel HX chips, but these are all high-end chips that are capable of high-end gaming performance.
So Matt, the CPU in here, 12-core, 16-core?
12-core chip, yeah.
12-core chip, right. So these are the AMD Strix Point chips, which do continue to support hyper-threading, right? As opposed to the Intel Arrow Lake, which has dropped it at this point.
Yes.
So you can run up to 24 threads concurrently, good for content creators, things like that. Actually, what about the AI capabilities? It's got AI in the name, right?
Yes, the chip does have AI in the name. That means it has, as AMD would like you to know by putting in that AI in the name, a powerful NPU up to 50 tops. So it is not, some of the Intel chips sort of have devalued the NPU, others have a high power NPU. That's the case here. This is the AI chip that has up to 50 tops, the capable NPU inside.
So enough about the CPU. Matt, can you tell me a bit about the 5090 in this machine?
Yes, that's what we're all here for. That's what we tested. The 50 series, based on the Blackwell architecture, you have 5th generation tensor cores, 4th generation ray tracing cores, the GDDR7 RAM in all of the RTX 50 laptop GPUs, so that's a nice upgrade. Those are coming to market for the first time. And the 5090, even more so than the others, differentiates itself further, 24 gigabytes of VRAM. So new type of RAM, 24, it's a lot for a laptop.
So Matt, with the RTX 50 series laptops, not only the 5090 and this Razer, but in all of them, big deal is what Nvidia is introducing in terms of its image upscaler and frame generation technology, DLSS. Support for DLSS 4 comes in here. Can you tell us a little bit about why that's such a big deal with these machines?
Yeah, the RTX 50 series is going to launch alongside DLSS 4. That's image resolution upscaling and, as you said, frame generation. Now, frame generation existed recently on the past generation of DLSS. The new model supports multi-frame generation. So frame generation lets you add in AI-generated frames between your traditionally rendered frames in your GPU to increase the frame rate. Multi-frame generation can do that several times. You can get, for every one traditionally rendered frame, you can put 3 artificially generated AI frames between those frames and make for a smoother experience. Now, people feel subjectively different about whether that looks the same as it does when they're rendered, whether you can tell. Sometimes it leaves artifacting, ghosting, things like that. So these are sort of pros and cons to it, but at the end of the day, you do get much higher frame rates with this technology active, and that is sort of the goal of multi-frame generation, is bringing both high-end GPUs with all the visual fidelity turned on to higher frame rates, and for lower-end systems that can't run it so well, to get that to a playable state using multi-frame generation.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, we'll bear that out in some of our testing here to see what the difference is. I mean, again, as you were saying, depending on the game, depending on the system in play, and depending on the GPU, you may experience, smoother frame rates, but may feel latency, in the experience, because even though you're running at a effectively higher frame rate, you're not necessarily polling at the same frame rate, or at the same rate that you are at the native frame rate if you were not using DLSS.
That's right.
So that's something we are going to get into at that level of detail. It very much depends on the game, and it depends on the system and a whole bunch of other factors.
And that did launch, to be fair, on the desktop card side first. So we have on the website deep dives into DLSS 4 existing already on how that fared on the desktop side. The technology is the same. Obviously, laptop chips are just less powerful than their desktop counterparts.
Right. And following from that, a good point to make is even though this is known as the RTX 5090 laptop GPU, that's not the same thing as the RTX 5090 desktop card. We shouldn't assume that the resources available to it and all that stuff is the same. The same amount of memory.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a big power differential between two of these. That's not the focus of this review. But just bear in mind that not all 5090s are created equal.
Yeah, and in fact, that's where DLSS kind of can shine, arguably, making up the physical thermal headroom between a full-size desktop graphics card and a laptop chip. You're not going to see the same performance. You're not going to reach the same performance. But if you buy something with a 5090 and you want high frame rates, DLSS can help take you to that next echelon of gaming, even while you turn on all the visual bells and whistles.
Right. And again, to reiterate, DLSS 4 has to be supported at the game level for it to kick in. Otherwise, some games may support a lower level of DLSS or not at all. But need to look for that specific support.
Yeah, it's been around for years, previous versions of DLSS, that is. So the game list that supports it is quite long by this point, but DLSS 4 will be pretty cutting edge for newer titles. So check if individual games are supported. Support's getting added all the time when developers update games and things like that. So right now, over 100 games, but there will continue to be more as the technology comes along.
All right, moving into synthetic testing here. First of all, we can point out that what we're comparing in all these numbers we're going to be presenting is the Razer Blade 16, the 5090, versus the Razer Blade 16 that we tested last year with a 4090.
Yes.
One caveat there is that this one is using, as we mentioned, the Strix Point Ryzen 9 AI 300 series processor that we talked about. The 2024 used an Intel Core i9 14900 HX processor, so we not 100% comparable. We can't get the same CPU.
A near perfect comparison, but yeah, they had different processor platforms, and that just sort of is what it is. They are both high performance laptops, so we're not hopefully bottlenecking anything as much as possible, but that the laptops are always tied with their CPU, so that is what it is.
Right. We had the same size, same general chassis, so that's going to be about as close as you can get to a strict 5090 versus 4090 comparison. So let's start out here with 3D Mark. That's UL's suite of graphics benchmarks. We're going to start here with the Wildlife Extreme subtest. Matt, how did it fare?
Yeah, you can see there's a bit of a margin, 46,455 points for the RTX 5090 and 43,181 points for the RTX 4090 system.
All right, so we're looking at about 7 to 8% delta there.
Not a huge improvement, which you'll probably see is somewhat of a pattern across these tests, but let's move through and get the specifics out of the next set of tests.
So moving on to the next test, that's 3D Mark Steel Nomad. How does that one look?
Similar margin, something of a pattern developing here. The RTX 5090, 5,718 points, and the 4090 Razer Blade, 4,986 points.
Yes, that's one of the larger deltas that I think we saw throughout, 14%, 15% thereabouts.
Yep.
So the next test is 3D Mark Solar Bay, which is a ray tracing intensive test. What did we see there, Matt?
105,715 points for the RTX 5090, 100,562 points for the RTX 4090.
So we're looking at about a 5% difference there.
Yeah.
Roughly, a little bit less than what we saw in Wildlife Extreme.
Nothing to write home about, but a moderate improvement really across all three of these. I think that sort of speaks to the marginal to moderate, depending on the scenario, raw improvement in horsepower that you sort of see over the from the 5090 over the 4090. That's where some gamers, depending who you ask, might be disappointed there's not more of a raw render difference between the two generations, but again, that is also where DLSS comes into play.
Right, so let's actually get into some real games, because sometimes synthetics could be a little misleading, depending on the test and depending on the GPU.
That's right.
So we're going to take a look here first at F1 2024, which is one of our standard benchmark games, and to give a little bit of context here, we're testing the laptop at both 1200p and 1600p resolution. 1600p is the native resolution of the machine, and then depending on the test, we'll tell you which graphic settings we used. But for F1, we strictly tested at ultra high with DLSS off.
Yes. And again, we see a solid improvement out of the RTX 5090, 117 frames per second versus 101 for the RTX 4090 system.
Right. This is at 1200p, correct? And that's around a 16% delta. How about at 1600p?
1600p, bumping up that resolution. We go from 85 frames per second on the RTX 5090 system to 71 frames per second on the RTX 4090 Razer Blade.
So that's one of the bigger deltas we saw. That's about 20%.
Yeah, some solid improvement out of that, even without turning DLSS on. Those are the sort of frame rate improvements that you probably are hoping for. And outside of a head-to-head comparison, that's sort of very playable frame rate. I don't think you can call 117 frames per second and at the higher resolution 85 frames per second anything but very playable, considering that the visual setting is cranked all the way up to maximum.
All right, so now moving on to the most demanding of our games, Cyberpunk 2077, 1200p testing. What do you see, Matt?
Yeah, so we test this game at ultra settings, which is the non-ray traced highest setting, and then the ray tracing overdrive setting, which is the over-the-top path traced ray tracing, all bells and whistles turned on, which is why you see such a reduction in frame rate. So you get 109 frames per second out of the RTX 5090 at Ultra and 41 frames per second out of the RTX 5090 set to ray tracing overdrive, and then the RTX 4090 103 frames per second on Ultra and 37 frames per second on ray tracing overdrive.
Got it. Yeah, so we're seeing about a 6% delta there at the Ultra setting and an 11% improvement at ray tracing overdrive. So slightly more improvement there with the maximum.
Yeah, just
setting.
raw frames, bang for your buck, better performance on the RTX 5090 before bringing any DLSS into the situation.
Okay, let me look at 1600p.
1600p, more demanding resolution. Interesting sort of dichotomy here at 1600p. 92 frames per second on the 5090 and 79 frames per second for the RTX 4090, and then they're nearly identical on the ray tracing overdrive setting.
Got it. Yeah, so we saw about 16% at the Ultra setting and then only 4% difference at the ray tracing overdrive.
Yeah, just
setting.
one frame between the two there.
Right, so that may vary a little bit from run to run, but looking like, at least in this game, at maximum settings, not as great a difference as we saw at the lower resolution.
Yeah, and this is sort of the most demanding test case. As we said, this is the most visually demanding game in our test suite, so if you're kind of trying to get a good idea at the top level performance and future proofing your purchase, these are the frame rates you can expect in sort of the most demanding game out currently, and you can kind of extrapolate what that will do in the future on new AAA titles with high quality visuals.
Right, yeah, we'll get back to Cyberpunk in a moment when we talk about DLSS, because there are ways of making this perform better with DLSS.
Yeah.
It's one of the sort of marquee games that support DLSS.
Totally.
All right, let's run over to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, which is our representative first-person massively multiplayer online shooter. So how are we looking there at 1200p?
Yeah, so 1200p performance on the minimum setting, 225 frames versus the RTX 4090's 234 frames, actually higher for the older chip on this test at this lower resolution on the minimum setting. That does reverse when you set the visual setting up to extreme. You have 173 frames per second for the 5090 and 159 frames per second for the 4090.
Yeah, so the first one might be an anomaly at the minimum setting, might be something that driver update.
Could be a CPU-bound difference as well between the two platforms.
Good point, yes. So, but that said, we're seeing about 9 to 10% on the extreme version there.
Yeah. I don't think most people will buy a 5090 to play most games on the lowest visual setting, but I can't say that entirely because for these types of competitive multiplayer shooters, especially professional or hardcore players, do want to turn these visual settings all the way down. So maybe that minimum visual setting is actually of special interest to those hardcore multiplayer ranked matchmaking grinders out there.
Got it. Okay, how about 1600p?
Yeah, 1600p, you have 190 frames per second on the RTX 5090 and 175 frames per second on the 4090 on the minimum setting. And then when you swap the visual quality to extreme, 123 frames per second on the 5090 and the 4090 pulled up 114 frames per second.
Right, so we're looking there at 7 to 8% in both cases difference there. So looking like a modest bump up, as you said before.
Yep.
All right, so let's. So these are the three main games that we run. We also do some testing with DLSS 4. Let's shift over to that. As for our DLSS testing, Matt, we've got three games here: Cyberpunk, F1 2024, and Call of Duty.
Yes.
Only Cyberpunk supports DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, so we'll get into that a little bit. And the other games are just there to show straight 1x frame gen improvements.
Yes.
So take it away. Let's see what we got in Cyberpunk.
Yeah, there's a lot of games out there that support, as we said, over 100 and counting games that support DLSS 4. Most of those don't have a built-in benchmark, which makes Cyberpunk one of our favorite testing games because you can mess with all of these different settings. So you'll see here, we ran the game without any DLSS or any frame generation on ray tracing overdrive, and then we upped it to turn DLSS on, and on top of that, we turned frame generation base level on, and then finally, DLSS multi-frame generation up to 4x. So you can see a pretty clear increase in these frame rates. We're just comparing the system to itself as we had it on hand, and the 5090 is able to do the multi-frame gen. We obviously didn't test that on the 4090 as it did not exist at the time. So only on ray tracing overdrive, only 24 frames per second with no help from DLSS. shows you how demanding and difficult to run this game is, when even the 5090 can't pull more frames down than that. With DLSS active on Ray Tracing Overdrive, you get 77 frames per second, which, to be fair, that's over 60 FPS target for a single-player AAA game. That's a smooth frame rate. Then from there, you turn on frame generation. It pulled 147 frames per second. And finally, with multi-frame generation on up to 4x, which is kind of the maximum scenario, 254 frames per second. Obviously, a lot of those are artificially generated and inserted between the truly rendered frames.
Let's see what else we got here for the non-multi-frame generation games.
Yeah, so we ran the same other titles. We have Call of Duty again on Extreme with DLSS turned on, and Extreme DLSS and frame generation on. Again, that's not multi-frame gen. This is not the newest version of DLSS. This is just to show what the RTX 5090 would do in existing non-supported DLSS games if you were still to turn these on, which is to say, they'll increase your frame rate quite a bit. 123 frames per second on Extreme. With DLSS on, you have 208 frames per second, and finally, with frame gen active, 243 frames per second.
Right. And I should point out, these are all being run with a native resolution of 1600p, correct?
Correct.
Okay, scaling from there.
Yep. So again, depending on the latency and the input lag and your own personal opinion, those things aren't a given in any different title, or even at any given time within the same game. You may experience some of that at one time and not the other. So your mileage may vary is basically what I'm saying, but Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 is one of those games where you don't want to have that latency and input lag. So while the frame rate is super high, I'm not saying always turn it on for everybody, but if you're running on a system that you feel confident getting high frame rates, that option is there for you, and if you don't mind the input lag, all the better. Finally, F1 2024. Once again, with TAA on only, which is no DLSS, that's our usual run of this game. 85 frames per second. Turning on DLSS, 124 frames per second, and finally with frame generation active, 242 frames per second. A pretty huge increase.
Oh, yeah. Fair enough. So for these particular games, it sounds like you need to sort of play them out and see whether the trade-off between DLSS's frame gen and the actual feel of the game and the actual rendering on screen, is worth the trade-off.
Right, because even in a game like Cyberpunk, that stuff might bother you less, even if you feel it, because it's not competitive. You're not against other people online. There's already the input from the internet to kind of factor in. If you're also having some sort of delay in your input because frame generation is active, you're going to kind of feel that effect. So totally your mileage may vary. That also goes for F1 if you're racing. That's a very fast reaction, fast-paced game, and you might feel those slight lags as you're trying to steer at high speeds.
Right. Yeah, actually, one thing that I would point out, I think we pointed this out when we were talking about the 5090 versus the 5080 desktop cards, that there's so many factors at play here that you really kind of just need to look online at enthusiasts who may have compared the specific game that you are into, because, we've looked at 3 here, but there's a universe of games out there. There's 100 DLSS 4 games out there plus at the moment. So you want to look and see what their experience has been like. Take everybody with a grain of salt, right? Look at different content creators and see what their conclusions are, but they may have some input into whether a game gets, kind of blurry, or if the input lag feels really, sort of noticeable in that genre or type of game. But again, bear in mind, your CPU, your GPU, and your specific laptop model all play into this. So it's a lot of sliders.
Yeah, I did, play myself on these different titles. I experienced a few different things. Mostly the image quality, especially on Cyberpunk for focusing in on DLSS 4, the image quality stays pretty sharp. You get a little bit of ghosting around characters walking around, outside, or a little input lag here and there, but for the most part, even cranked up all the way, the game felt pretty smooth. I also played Avowed, which is outside of our test suite. That's a game that does support DLSS 4, and you will notice some frame differences and a little bit of input lag here and there. You are free to switch DLSS on and off, frame gen on and off separately, so you can kind of have DLSS only if you want without the frame gen. You can also always tune the level of DLSS, whether it's quality mode or performance mode. So there's a lot of different kinds of things to mess with even within these individual settings, and it will entirely depend sort of on your own opinion, unfortunately, about what bothers you and what doesn't, because one person could be bothered by little visual artifacts or a slight feeling of delay, and someone else might just be happy their system's running at a high frame rate.
Right, and the one thing bear in mind on top of all this talk of DLSS, not DLSS, and all of that, is the 5090, the test numbers that we saw, you crank everything all the way up to the native resolution of this laptop, 1600p, you're probably going to get playable frame rate, with the exceptions of some of the most demanding games out there where you may need to kick some down, a tick or two.
Like that Cyberpunk ray tracing overdrive without the help of DLSS, even that on the 5090 is only getting 24 frames per second. So, you're going to need the help of some of these systems. As nice as it is to think that you just buy the highest end GPU and your 60 plus frames, set it and forget it, these games are really demanding if you want the ray tracing bells and whistles on them in particular. And you kind of have to accept, even if you see some visual downsides, accept the help of DLSS on that front.
Right, or kick down just the graphic setting you're just going to run without DLSS at all if it's a game that doesn't support it.
Yeah, that holds true even on desktop side, so imagine the constraints on a laptop.
Right, fair enough. So one thing to talk about here is battery life. Now, we're not talking about battery life in the sense of how long does it take to run this thing down in everyday work. We're talking about playing games specifically on the 50 series off the plug. Now, as anybody who's owned a gaming laptop knows, you get a very big difference in battery life between when you're working with spreadsheets or browsing the web or you're playing a AAA game off the plug. And you can oftentimes, almost watch the battery meter go down if you're doing it off the plug.
Yeah.
But one of the claims NVIDIA's made around the 50 series is a pretty significant uptick in off-plug gaming battery life.
Yeah.
So we did not have the previous generation 4090-based version of this to compare it to, but Matt, you had a little bit of experience with this.
Making sure what the new setting is called battery boost, making sure that's toggled on in the NVIDIA app. I played Avowed off the charger for a while, and it's hard to say how it would have, run in other scenarios in the past, but I got an hour and a half of battery life gaming time. That's with all the bells and whistles turned on. That was a pretty high visual setting. That was with DLSS active. This laptop was working very hard to produce fairly realistic 3D open world game for an hour and a half. That varies greatly by game. You can definitely get longer battery life out of simpler games. You can turn the visual fidelity or even the resolution down. There's a lot of ways to save battery. Battery Boost sort of dynamically sees what you're doing and gauges the components accordingly, which can help extend that battery life and is a pretty cool feature. But yeah, that'll take a lot more extensive A/B testing, I think, to really get a hard conclusion. And it will always vary by the laptop components, thermal design, and all those factors that go into it.
Yeah, one thing we can point out is that this new battery boost function is on by default in these machines, so you don't need to do a whole bunch of configuration around it. But it just comes down to really, as a gamer, is this your primarily sitting at home on the couch close to a plug gaming system, or are you really going to try and use this, say, on cross-country bus or on, a train or something like that where there's no place to plug in for an hour or so and you really want to be able to rev it up. But seeing an hour and a half nonstop, you're talking nonstop gaming.
Right? Full gaming time the whole time. That sounds short relative to a laptop battery life, but bless you if you have a ton of opportunities to do this, but an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3, maybe on a less demanding game of uninterrupted battery gaming time isn't that common, I would have to imagine. I do it every now and then, and maybe if you're on a flight or a long bus ride or something like you said, that will only be a fraction of your trip, which is unfortunate, but there are sort of limits to this sort of thing.
Right, really every half hour, so you should get up. Stretch.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's get into the overall value proposition here and who these are good for. All right, so this is the first of the 5090 systems that we've tested. There'll be plenty more 50 series laptops coming through, some more 5090s at different power levels, and then some less expensive machines. But very hard to draw a firm conclusion across the 50 series line based on our experience with one laptop that we've had for about a week.
Yeah.
Matt, what would you say, though, to somebody who owns, say, a previous generation 4090 machine who might be considering one of these 5090 machines, assuming that this Razer is represented above them?
Sure. Yeah, multiple things to caveat there, I would say. One, the Razer is already an expensive laptop. This is going to be one of the pricier ways to get, an RTX 5090, even though that's an expensive GPU, no matter how you slice it. Right now, there are some laptops available for pre-order that are $4,200. None of them are cheap if you're getting an RTX 5090. That's just the way of things. So this is $4,500 as configured, as a reminder. So expensive, no matter how you slice it. Even outside of the specific laptop, though, as I said, the others are in a similar price range. Right. To want to upgrade from the 4090 or another 40 series GPU, you have to be really an enthusiast with a big budget that you have extra to spend on this sort of thing.
Right.
It is not going to be a game-changing amount of performance, especially because DLSS 4 will work on the RTX 40 series, so you can get that sort of benefit from that side, even if you're not getting the raw horsepower improvement. Aside from that, we saw that NVIDIA shared with us 70% of people, as I said, are running on RTX 30 series or earlier GPUs. Those are the people who are probably going to be looking more, maybe not at the 5090, but the other 50 series GPUs. So we can't attest the performance of those GPUs at this time. We did only get the 5090 in for initial testing, so we'll have to see about more budget and mid-range gamers upgrading to some of those other GPU options. But the 5090, if you're on a 4090 already and you're a huge frame hound, maybe you'll see 10% in some cases, maybe 5%. It's a little bit of back and forth depending on what game, and I would say it's not a game-changing amount of increased performance.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. And if you're a content creator, and you're looking at it from the point of view of, okay, I'm getting a 5090 for its additional, GPU accelerated oomph. If you're going to see a big uptick from one processor to another, depending on what you're coming from, that may be an additional thing. But just looking at the raw frame sort of power that we're seeing, from the 4090 to the 5090, it's probably, unless you can recoup a whole bunch of money from your 4090 and sell it on or something like that, you're probably going to be more likely as a 30 series user find these more attractive.
Yeah, this is truly for the cutting edge. Higher and tops out of the GPU if you have AI workloads to work on. Codec improvements as well go along with this new platform. So there are other professional use cases outside of like how many more frames am I getting from this new very expensive laptop, but it's not that no one should upgrade. And if you have sat out laptops for a while, you should definitely consider jumping into the 50 series. And also, frankly, is just going to be what's on the market if you go to buy a laptop in the next year. 40 series will be around for a while, and we'll probably see laptops continue to be sold sort of at a lower price range, and also the stock will remain available for some time, but eventually you're going to be looking at 50 series laptops to buy for anything new.
Right. For now, we only know about the 5070, 5070 Ti, 5080, and 5090 that are coming, and I believe the price range that we're looking at, even with the 5070s, is in the wolves at $1399 and upgrade. So we haven't heard anything yet about budget machines. 40 series may stick around in those, but these will probably start to supplant the high end as time goes on.
Right.
So we're going to be looking forward to looking at a whole bunch more 50 series laptops as the year goes on. I expect that we'll probably see a 5090 in a thicker chassis from somebody like an MSI or an Asus, who may be able to squeeze even more out of a machine than you could get out of a thin, nice Razer Blade. And we'll certainly get down to those when the time comes. So we're going to have to stay tuned for that. Ben, any final thoughts on the 50 series first impressions?
No, outside of whether or not it's sort of takes the focus, the generation on generation improvement. But again, I'm trying to stress that's not the reality of every shopper's sort of buying experience. If you take that sort of direct comparison out of it, it's fun to test laptops with this level of technology in them and sort of see what kind of frame rates they can push, and also kind of measure and accept the fact that the machine learning side is here to stay. We're not going to get rid of things like DLSS. I think you kind of have to embrace it because some of these games in their visual settings are going to start leaning on that stuff. They're going to expect you to be running DLSS to even make use of path tracing, to make use of ray tracing. So, maybe getting the stigma off DLSS. I don't know what it is. It's subjective per person. So everyone's going to feel differently about that. I think it's neat on the high end, and I think it's almost essential on the low end that we're going to have people able to experience cutting edge games on less powerful and less expensive systems. If you can only support buying an entry level gaming laptop and it runs DLSS, that's great for you. You get to play Cyberpunk at all. So that sort of thing, I think will be accepted more over time.
Right. So you were saying a lot of fun to be testing systems like this. We're going to be having an awful lot of fun this spring and this summer as all these different SKUs.
Careful what I wish for, I think.
I think so. Yeah, so they'll be crossing your desk. So thank you for watching. We're going to have plenty more on the RTX 50 series as the spring and summer go on, and plenty more numbers for you. So stay tuned to PCMag.com and check in for the latest reviews.